Thank you. The next segment will be presented by Dr. Rick Arthur, whom you know is also a former president of the AAP, very well-known racetrack practitioner in California especially, and he has recently allowed himself to take on the task in a regulatory sense, and I think he's very dedicated. It shows his dedication to try to get things done, and we're delighted to have Dr. Arthur here.
Thank you, Ed. Well, rather than talk about statistics, I'm actually going to be throwing out some numbers, and they're actually just food for thought, and it should hopefully stimulate some ideas in the work section about what we actually need to be looking at, because you can cut these numbers, as you can see, in a lot of different ways, and trying to figure out the relationships is not easy. It may not even be possible. Obviously, the starts per starter by year has decreased precipitously over the last 50 years. Years raced has gone down, and obviously starts per year times years raced gives us a total number of starts we get out of each starter. This doesn't say anything about the horses that don't start, by the way, and that's about a 40% reduction in 40 years. So why are we seeing this? And obviously that's why we're here today. This is an example of what we actually see in the racing environment, and this is a study that we did with Wayne McElraith at Southern California with Dr. Vince Baker and Jeff Blay and myself and Wayne's team on a Grayson Jockey Club grant looking at biomarkers. We started out with 238 horses. They were all 2- and 3-year-olds, and we began in March of 2002. And horses left the study for 3 reasons. They experienced a musculoskeletal injury, which required a greater than 30-day rest. They were out of training for 30 days for some other reason, or lost to the study. They went someplace else, maybe a different racing jurisdiction, sold, and sent out of California. And out of the 238 horses that we started with, there were only 18 left 10 months later that were still on the racetrack and hadn't left. Some of them actually have left and come back, but the ones that were still in the study were less than 10%, 18 out of 238. Looking at this issue from a racetrack management perspective, we took a look at trying to figure out what's going on here. We put together a think tank in Southern California, and one of the issues that we wanted to find out are where are these horses going. And we took 4 sample groups. One of them was all the horses that started the first day in May, which ended up to be May 2nd, a Wednesday. In 2001, this think tank was about 2 years later, and all the horses in the barn of John Sadler's, Dick Mandella's, and Barry Abrams. Dick Mandella has a very high-class stable. John Sadler is in between, and Barry Abrams runs a lot of cheap claimers. And what we found over that particular period of time was that the horses leave the... Do we have a pointer, by the way?
Put in that next, just got one in his pocket.
There we go. What we actually see is the blue is starts anywhere, starts anywhere, and the reddish is the starts in Southern California. And what you'll actually see is these decline over a period of time. Our horses only last an average in California for about, their half-life's about 12 months. This isn't a statistical calculation, it's a graphical estimation. And they only last in horse racing about 18 months. And if you take the horses on this particular day, May 2nd, it just so happened that they only lasted 6 months in California, and they still lasted 18 months. Most of these horses end up going elsewhere. And it doesn't necessarily mean the blue line, the top line, if they're gone from there, they're gone from horse racing, they're out of the sport. If they're not in racing in Southern California, they could be going elsewhere, and a lot of them do. So for our discussion, the top line is the most important line. And so horses are basically around for about half-life. We lose half of the horses every 18 months. The interesting thing is, in California, we lost almost a fourth of the horses within 60 days. And most importantly, we lost about 10% of the horses within 60 days. This actually goes along relatively well with some of the other information we have. We went back for this study and we compared May 2nd of 2001 at New York and compared New York and California. And you can see it's a very similar distribution, and they still have about roughly the same half-life, which is in the 18-month neighborhood. In other words, we're losing, and these horses on the right hand of the screen are not necessarily running at New York. They just started in New York and California this date. Usually by the time they're over here, they're at tracks that you may not even recognize. And one thing I'd like to point out is towards the tail end of that curve, not all of these horses necessarily won't be coming back. We just used a cutoff point. And the period that some of these horses have been turned out and come back to racing can be quite extensive. This is a horse that was out 23 months before he came back. So the point of that is that this curve actually doesn't go straight down. It kind of tends to go out. In fact, some of the horses from New York, because that's the only data I had that goes out this far, were still running in 2006. So when you look at this, we're losing about 3% a month. If you figure out, and it correlates along with the 3 years, the same data that we saw before. The average number of starts is very similar to what we have today, so this is probably a pretty good representative sample. And if you take this particular data, 4% of the horses, and if you're generous and say we have 4,000 horses on our circuit, that we're losing about 160 horses a month. Those aren't necessarily horses that are lost from horse racing, they're just lost from Southern California racing. And at a $25,000 horse, that's $4 million a month in horse flesh that has to be replaced just to maintain the inventory. If it's $100,000, you're talking about $16 million worth of horses. And the reality is probably somewhere in between. But what's the overall loss? We can estimate the loss is about 3% a month, and in 2000 there were 69,000 starters at $25,000 per horse, which is the median start. That's $52 million worth of horses a month that we're losing from horse racing. If you go to the average auction price in 2000, which was about $54,000, you're talking about $113 million a month in horse flesh that has to be replaced. And even though I'm a director of a racetrack, I have a little bit of a horseman's background, and when racetracks talk about their capital investment, I think we need to recognize the capital investment of horsemen into this industry as well. That does, by the way, that says nothing about the upkeep expenses. That's just the purchase price of the horse flesh. When you look at this, the real driver of handle is field size. It's well recognized, and anybody in the racetrack operating business recognizes that. And all you have to do is increase one start a year per horse, and it makes a dramatic difference in your field size. When we talk about, there's a term called wastage, and that's basically how you lose these horses. There's breeding factors, mare slip, horse management factors from the way horses are trained, the way they're shod, the type of veterinary care they have, and obviously there's track design maintenance, which has become an avenue to try to address some of these issues more frequently. But if you look at some of the breeding factors, it's really interesting when you look at how the selective pressures have changed over a period of time. This data I have only goes back to 1955, but back then there were only about a little over 20% of the females in any particular crop ended up going to the breeding shed. And over a period of time, you can see how that has increased over time rather markedly. In other words, we've taken the selective pressure out, and I think all of us that certainly veterinarians at the racetrack will see a filly come in, can't run, breaks her sesamoid at first 3/8 of a mile work, and the owner tells you, well, I'm going to send her to the breeding shed. And that's just a dream for veterinarians, is all I have to say. But seriously, the fact is we've taken away a lot of the selective pressures. And again, when you look at this, you can compare, not only do we have the starters, but the foals, the total foals out of a particular crop. And over the years, it's usually been between somewhere a little below 70% of the foals actually make it to the races. But we actually saw a drop in the period that the 80s and 90s, and that also correlated with an increase in the number of mares that went to the breeding shed. And conceivably, and whether it is or not, there's no statistical analysis, it could be associated with the fact of the selective pressure on what sort of mares are we breeding and what sort of foals are we getting. These horses in 1990, a little over 60% of them even made them to the races, whereas it had been 70% most of the time. If you look at other factors like 2-year-olds training, I think there's not a lot of indication that 2-year-old sales are involved. You can look at this in a number of ways, and we have in our data packets all sorts of data you can cut up. But if you look at the overall careers of horses, you know, it's very rare that horses stay around for a long period of time in horse racing. Our whole program is directed towards 3-4-year-old races, and after that, we just don't keep them around for a long period of time. Obviously, if we can figure out a strategy to keep horses around, as we talked about, number of average years raced makes a dramatic increase in the number of starts per horse in a particular crop. You talk about management. One of the fascinating issues that I've noticed over years is how hard horses are trained. And this is a relatively short period of time. And part of this is from the fact that California has an enormous number of works per start. We also have a situation in California that almost all the horses that are working are getting registered works, certainly after 3/8 of a mile. But it's a rather dramatic difference from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of the number of workouts horses have per individual start. You also look at the intensity of that work, and we were able to get data from Belmont and took 5 furlong works back to 1940 from a selective sample from the racing form. And back in the 40s, the fastest work on the days we looked at were a little over 101 and change. And you can see that over the years that's changed from time to time. It may just be the day we get, but certainly the impression is, and this isn't statistically analyzed, that horses are working faster now than they were before. We don't have the number of workouts from the early 50s to compare that. Santa Anita, we have a little bit different sample, but over time it certainly is the impression, and I think it anecdotally, as somebody who's been in that environment, horses definitely work faster today. I like to tell the story that I can remember when Charlie Whittingham worked Cougar in 11 and change, and we all talked about it at the racetrack. Today you'll pick up a racing form and there'll be a bottom of the barrel Calbred maiden claiming, and you'll have a horse work in 11 and change. Average race times have dropped. This is all across the country. Seeing a little bit of a change in that in 2005. Southern California times, we had our fastest times in 1995, and actually those times are slowing up a little bit. Percentage that did not finish in the last 10, 14 years really hasn't changed much at all. But in California, which is, to my knowledge, is the only racing jurisdiction that actually has a rule that every horse that dies within enclosure has to be necropsied. And Sue Stover will be talking about some of this a little bit later, some of the data from this, even ponies, but these are just thoroughbred fatalities, and these are racing and training injuries. We've seen a marked increase in those in the last few years, and I don't think 2006 is going to be any improvement. The disturbing aspect of this is the number of fatalities per start is a very worrisome number, something that I think that others may bring up later. When we go back a few slides to the number of workouts and the intensity of the workouts, I think Dr. Stover is going to be presenting some information you'll find interesting. The way horses are managed is, you can often get a short-term approach to the way horses are managed. And here is a chip and a knee. I don't know how well you can see it up here, and there's two ways to go. You can take that chip out, do the surgery, give the horse the time off, and the horse has a good chance of a longer career, or you can inject the horse, get the horse running in a few days, lose him in a claiming race, and solve your problems that way. It's almost like the short-term fix as to the long-term fix. There are management decisions you can make, and this happens all the time. So how do management decisions in terms of veterinary care affect long-term? We do know from the California program that there is an increased risk of suspensory ligament damage with horses with high toe grabs. Suspensory ligament damage is associated with lateral condylar fractures, and lateral condylar fractures are increased risk of catastrophic injury, and close to half of the fatal breakdowns have something to do with the ankle somewhere around in the bottom line. Mick will be talking about track surfaces. I think we've seen a big change in the industry the last few years trying to address this particular injury. But we do know that tracks, different surfaces, racing in new market as compared to American racing, you used to get more pasterns, split pasterns in Europe than we would ever see, and we obviously have more condylar fractures, certainly a factor. And hopefully some of the track injury and safety studies will give us some information and try to figure out what that relationship is. Anyway, that's all I have to say, and hopefully I've given you some food for thought. There's no solid answers here. I think we have to look at all the data we've had and figure out where do we want to direct our efforts. But there's a lot of blame to go around for this, and I think we just have to figure out what solutions that we possibly can come up with. Thank you.